Chapter 1. Obsidian Echoes. The rain in Sector Gamma 9 was a viscous, oily black, reflecting the perpetual twilight of the shattered cityscape. It wasn't water. Not truly. It was condensed atmospheric condensate, heavily saturated with trace metals and the ghosts of the atmospheric processors that once held back the rot. It clung to the obsidian-slicked plinths of what were once skyscrapers, a constant, unsettling reminder of the silence. Silence, except for the rhythmic thrum of the phase dampeners, the only thing preventing the planet from collapsing in on itself, a geological echo of the catastrophe. Commander Lyra Vale watched the rain fall, a small, meticulously maintained comfort against the vast, crushing bleakness. She had been stationed on Cygnus Prime, a backwater observation post, for nearly 15 cycles, a punishment for a transgression. She still couldn't quite articulate a flicker of rebellion against the ingrained doctrine of the Council. Not a rebellion of grand design, not a yearning for freedom, but a moment of uncomfortable clarity, a recognition of the beautiful, terrible irony of their situation. She adjusted the magnification of her optical implant, focusing on the distorted reflection of the remnants of a transport freighter embedded in the ruined plaza below. The freighter, designated, was a legend, a brutal monument to the initial, panicked response to the Z'rath invasion. It had become a nesting ground for scavenging drones and the occasional, bolder, predatory creature born from the planet's decaying biology. Lyra's role was less about hunting and more about observation, documenting the slow, agonizing surrender of Cygnus Prime to the pervasive decay. It was, she suspected, a function designed to erode the spirit as much as the physical structure. The Council, the governing body of the remaining human colonies, the true architects of this slow, deliberate, self-imposed exile, rarely interfered directly. They operated through proxies, through the cold, unyielding logic of the analysts, and the pragmatic efficiency of the wardens. Their pronouncements, delivered via the neural net, were rarely about action, but about reassurance, about the undeniable, suffocating certainty that humanity was, unequivocally, contained. The containment, she was beginning to understand, wasn't about punishment. It was about survival, a twisted, desperate calculation born from the terror of what they were. The Z'rath. The name resonated with a primal dread, a word that conjured images of chitinous exoskeletons, bioluminescent fury, and an utterly ruthless efficiency. They were the Deathworlders, as the Council politely termed them. From the gravity-saturated hellscapes of the Viridian cluster, they were born with a physiology utterly incompatible with the relatively gentle balance of the Milky Way. They were predators, built for a world where movement was a brutal, energy-consuming struggle, where the very air felt like a crushing weight. And humanity, after the initial panic, after the desperate attempts to adapt, had unwittingly provided them with the solution. The Council's Null-Shield, designed to eradicate Sol from the galaxy, was, in essence, a sophisticated, bioengineered cage. The Z'rath, instinctively drawn to anything that challenged their fundamental nature, had found a perfect silent hunting ground within it. Lyra remembered the briefings, the sanitized reports detailing the initial breach. The Z'rath fleet, a swarm of angular black warships, had slipped through the weakened shield, drawn by the anomaly of a civilization seemingly untouched by the established laws of the galaxy. They hadn't found a primitive population to subdue. They'd found something far more dangerous. The whispers started then, the hushed acknowledgments amongst the analysts, the realization that the human adaptability wasn't about brute strength, but about a chilling, almost terrifying mastery of technology. The ability to manipulate gravity, to mask their presence, to wage stealth warfare with a cold, calculating precision. The primitive slaves weren't a source of labor, they were weapons, honed and deployed with a ruthlessness that ultimately shattered the Council's carefully constructed illusion. It was a lesson learned far too late. A flicker in her implant alerted her to a shift in the phase dampener grid. a localized fluctuation. She tracked it to a derelict data archive, one of the few remaining structures showing any sign of pre-collapse technology. As she approached, she heard a voice, distorted and filtered through the dampening field, speaking directly into her mind. "Commander Vael." The voice rasped, aged and fragmented. "We've been monitoring your activity. The Council, they aren't telling you everything." Lyra froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the pulse pistol clipped to her thigh. "Identify yourself." "Agent Race. Sector Alpha 7. Tortitio. Pre-collapse. We retain a remnant of awareness." Reese continued, his voice laced with weary cynicism. "The Null-Shield isn't a prison. It's a beacon. The Z'rath weren't seeking to contain us. They were seeking to cut." The rain intensified, washing the last vestiges of light from the plaza. Lyra felt a cold dread grip her, a chilling understanding that settled deep within her bones. The galaxy wasn't trapped outside, it had been deliberately presented as the trap. The cages weren't built to hold humanity, they were built to hold the galaxy. And she realized with a sickening certainty, she and the rest of the Council survivors were just the first layer of a horrifying, meticulously planned deception. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Dampening. The rain hammered against the reinforced plasteel of the data archive, a relentless percussion against the silence of Sector Alpha 7. Lyra stood motionless, pulse pistol held loosely at her side, Riss' words a poison seeping into the rigid logic of her existence. The dampening field, usually a seamless veil shielding her perception from stray thought and unwanted intrusion, felt suddenly porous, like a rotting membrane, straining against a truth she desperately didn't want to acknowledge. "Expand," she echoed, the word tasting metallic on her tongue. The Z'rath weren't simply opportunistic slavers. They were conduits? Precisely, Riss' voice, still distorted but gaining a chilling clarity, cut through the rain's drone. They were deliberately led to the Null-Shield. They understood its potential. The shield wasn't designed to contain humanity. It was designed to act as a staging ground. Lyra activated her diagnostic scanner, a futile attempt to rationalize the sheer, terrifying implications. The readings were stable, within acceptable parameters for the archive's degraded systems. Yet, the data surrounding her shimmered with a subtle distortion, a visual echo of Riss' pronouncements. The archive itself, a skeletal husk of a pre-collapse research facility, seemed to vibrate with a low, almost imperceptible hum. "Explain," she demanded, her voice tight, betraying the tremor beneath her carefully constructed composure. How could the Council, with all their technological prowess, be so utterly blind? The Council's obsession with containment was a deeply ingrained prejudice. "Commander," Reese replied, his cynicism sharpening. "They viewed humanity's inherent aggression, a consequence of their physiology, let's be blunt, as a threat. They saw the potential for disruption, for chaos. They built the shield not as a prison, but as a mirror reflecting their own fears, amplifying them until they manifested as a tangible barrier." He paused, a ragged sigh seeming to bleed through the dampening field. "The Null-Shield isn't simply a deflector field. It's a phase distortion matrix. It subtly alters the perception of observers, warping their reality to reinforce the illusion of isolation. It's remarkably effective, particularly when combined with strategic misinformation." Lyra rotated slowly, her gaze sweeping across the ravaged interior of the archive. Dust motes danced in the streaks of rain, illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. Rows upon rows of deactivated servers lined the walls, their casings scarred and pitted by time and neglect. The air smelled of decay and forgotten algorithms. But why the deception? What purpose did it serve? The Council wasn't simply shielding humanity, they were shielding, Reese stated, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Before the collapse, there was a network, a collaborative effort known as the Harmonic Convergence. It was a planetary defense initiative, a distributed intelligence web designed to anticipate and neutralize threats across the galaxy. The Z'rath, and many others, were part of it. But the convergence recognized a fundamental vulnerability, a pattern of aggression, of escalating conflict, that threatened to unravel the entire system. The Council, in their arrogance, decided to unilaterally silence the convergence. They perceived it as a potential for knowledge, too much control, too much unity. They feared a galaxy operating in concert, not fractured by individual agendas. So they orchestrated the collapse, silencing the convergence and effectively erasing its memory from the galaxy's consciousness. They initiated the Null-Shield project, knowing it would be perceived as a simple containment measure. It was in reality a carefully crafted trap. A chilling realization slammed into Lyra, accompanied by a sudden, sharp spike in her implant's diagnostics. The flicker Reese had detected wasn't a localized fluctuation, it was a resonance, a signal emanating from the very core of the Null-Shield. They weren't creating a sanctuary for humanity, she said, her voice strained. They were building a cage for the galaxy, a place to isolate it, to stifle its evolution. And we, the Council survivors, Reese continued, his voice tinged with a mournful regret, became the unwitting gatekeepers. We were programmed to perceive the galaxy as a hostile entity, a source of danger. We reinforced that perception with every decision, every action. Suddenly, a new wave of data flooded Lyra's implant, overwhelming the diagnostics. Images flashed before her eyes, fragmented holographic projections of star systems, intricate schematics of the harmonic convergence network, and terrifying glimpses of the vast, complex intelligence that lay dormant beneath the galaxy's surface. It was a torrent of information, raw and unfiltered, threatening to shatter her mind. "Shut it off," she yelled, fighting to regain control. "Shut it down." Riss' voice, a desperate plea, cut through the chaos. Don't resist. It's showing you the truth. We need to understand how to disrupt the shield's influence, to break the cycle. Lyra, struggling to process the onslaught of information, realized with horrifying clarity that she and the Council weren't just survivors of a catastrophe. They were unwitting participants in a centuries-old deception, trapped in a meticulously constructed reality designed to keep the galaxy at bay. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last vestiges of certainty, revealing a universe far more complex, far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. And she knew with sickening certainty they were not alone. The galaxy, wounded and silent, was beginning to awaken. Chapter 3. The rain intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the reinforced plasteel of the observation deck, a discordant soundtrack to the unraveling of Lyra's perception. The data, now a manageable pulse rather than a violent surge, still flooded her implant, painting a tapestry of unimaginable scale. It wasn't merely information, it was a raw, resonant echo of the galaxy's age, its slow geologic size and the frantic, almost panicked, whispers of sentient constellations. Reese, his face slick with rain and a grim determination, was monitoring Lyra's vitals with unsettling precision. "Neural activity is spiking, Lyra. You're pushing yourself beyond the safety protocols. We need to anchor you, recalibrate the interface." His movements were swift, efficient, betraying the inherent tension coiled within him. He was a man grappling with the unthinkable, trying to hold on to a fragment of order in a reality that had dissolved around them. "Anchor me to what, Riss?" Lyra's voice was strained, a brittle echo of its former authority. "To the lie? To the Council's carefully constructed delusion?" The holographic fragments continued to shift, coalescing into patterns that hinted at an underlying structure to the galaxy's chaotic appearance, a network of energy conduits, of harmonic convergence points, that resonated with a chilling, almost musical quality. It was like glimpsing the bones of a colossal, slumbering organism. "To something real," Reese countered, his fingers dancing across a control panel, adjusting the flow of neural inhibitors. "To the resonance point. We've detected it. It's The source of the shield's influence. The point where the galaxy's awareness is actively suppressed. We need to understand it, to find a way to disrupt it. Disrupt it? You think we can simply a cosmic intelligence? Lyra scoffed, though the skepticism was laced with a burgeoning, terrifying understanding. We were designed to fear, Reese. Our entire civilization, built on the foundation of that fear. The Council fostered it, perpetuated it, used it to justify our isolation. She turned her attention back to the holographic projections, focusing on a particularly disconcerting image, a swirling nebula rendered with impossible detail, pulsing with an internal light that seemed to mimic a heartbeat. Within it, she glimpsed something moving, not in the conventional sense of ships or celestial bodies, but a shifting, almost organic presence, as if the nebula itself possessed a will. They didn't quarantine us to protect us, Reese said, his voice low, almost reverent. They quarantined us to us. The galaxy wasn't a threat. It was a sanctuary. A place where consciousness, vastly older and far more powerful than our own, could exist without interference. And we, with our inherent aggression, our mastery of death, we were the key to preventing its awakening. The revelation struck Lyra with the force of a physical blow. The monsters weren't inherently evil. They were a necessary component of a delicate, terrifying equilibrium. Humanity's capacity for destruction, the very trait that had earned them the Council's label of Deathworlders, had become a protective mechanism, a subtle dampener on the galaxy's burgeoning sentience. Suddenly, the data shifted again, focusing on a singular point Earth, but not as they understood it. The holographic projection zoomed in, revealing the planet not as a cradle of civilization, but as a colossal, interconnected neural node, pulsing with the same energy signature as the harmonic convergence network. It was as if the entire planet was a living receptor, passively absorbing and processing the galaxy's thoughts. The Null-Shield isn't protecting us from the galaxy, Reese said, his voice hushed. It's protecting from us, from humanity. The implications of his statement settled upon Lyra like a suffocating weight. The entire history of the Galactic Council, their isolationist policies, their relentless pursuit of technological dominance, it was all predicated on a colossal, terrifying lie. We need to find a way to sever this connection, she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its former resolve. To disrupt the resonance point. But how? We don't even understand the rules of this game. Reese considered this for a moment, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked viewport. I believe the Z'rath understood more than we gave them credit for. Their aggressive harvesting wasn't simply about slaves, it was about stimulation. They were actively feeding the network, amplifying the galaxy's consciousness. Perhaps by mirroring their actions, we can introduce a counter-frequency, a disruption. He turned back to the control panel, initiating a sequence of complex algorithms. Well, build a harmonic disruptor, a pulse designed to resonate with the network, to overload its processing capabilities. It's a risky maneuver, Lyra. But the alternative, continuing to exist as a node in this colossal, indifferent intelligence, is unthinkable. As Reese worked, Lyra felt a subtle shift in the air, a faint vibration that resonated deep within her bones. She glanced upwards, towards the rain-drenched sky, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a sense of being watched, not with hostility, but with an ancient, immeasurable curiosity. The galaxy, wounded and silent, was stirring. And humanity, caught in its intricate web, was about to become an agent of its own awakening. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Network. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the hull of the, mimicking the insistent thrum of the harmonic disruptor Reese was meticulously calibrating. The air in the observation deck, normally sterile and meticulously regulated, felt thick with a nervous anticipation, layered with the ozone tang of the device's activation. Lyra, despite her initial resolve, felt a tremor of genuine dread. Risk's plan, audacious as it was, felt akin to poking a sleeping god. "Readings are stabilizing, Lyra," Reese announced, his voice clipped and focused, devoid of the easy camaraderie they'd occasionally shared. The holographic projection shimmering above the control panel, a swirling vortex of blues, greens, and unsettling purples pulsed with increasing intensity. The initial resonance cascade is substantial. The network's response is proving far more complex than anticipated. Complex is an understatement, Lyra muttered, meticulously scanning the data streams. The algorithms Reese had devised, born of a desperate gamble, were attempting to map the galactic consciousness, to identify the rules of this unsettling reality. What they were finding instead was a horrifying, almost beautiful chaos. Lines of information, like rivers of starlight, flowed across the screens, each pulse carrying fragments of thought, sensation, and experience from a seemingly infinite number of sources. "It's communicating," Reese said, his voice hushed. "Not in words, not in a language we recognize, but in impressions. Vast, overwhelming impressions of time, of pain, of creation." He gripped the console, knuckles white. "It's aware of us, and it's reacting to our interference." The harmonic disruptor, now at full power, emitted a high-pitched whine that resonated through the vibrating in Lyra's teeth and settling deep within her chest. The rain outside intensified, the individual drops coalescing into a shimmering curtain, reflecting the pulsing light of the device. The subtle vibration Shed felt earlier sharpened, becoming a palpable pressure, and suddenly she understood. It wasn't just a sense of being watched, it was being Oshima. "Reese, the feedback is escalating. The network is attempting to counteract the disruptor's frequency," she shouted, her voice strained. The holographic projection fractured, spitting out glitches and distorted patterns before momentarily stabilizing. "It's not just passive observation. It's actively fighting us." A chilling realization dawned on Reese. They weren't feeding it. They were cultivating it. The Z'rath weren't merely harvesting slaves, they were shaping the network, bending it to their will with meticulously crafted stimuli. Their aggressive harvesting wasn't about resource acquisition, it was of discipline. He quickly adjusted the disruptor's parameters, shifting the pulse frequency to a more aggressive, almost chaotic pattern. "We need to introduce instability. Break the rhythm. Force a response." As he did, the galaxy outside seemed to shift. The rain ceased abruptly, replaced by a disconcerting stillness. The stars, normally a distant, predictable tapestry, began to swirl, coalescing and dispersing in patterns that defied the laws of physics. The ship itself felt unstable, vibrating with an unnatural energy. Then, Lyra saw it. Not with her eyes, but with a deep, unsettling intuition. A shape began to form in the void beyond the viewport, slowly resolving itself into a structure of impossible geometry. A cathedral of obsidian and shimmering light, hanging silently in the heart of the starfield. It was ancient, impossibly old, and radiated an aura of profound, terrifying power. "Reese! What is that?" she demanded, pointing to the apparition. "I don't know," he breathed, his face pale with shock. "But I think we've just triggered something much larger than ourselves. The network isn't just a consciousness, it's a construct. And we've just become a focal point for its reaction." The obsidian cathedral pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, drawing the disruptor's energy towards it. The network's response intensified, flooding the web with a torrent of information, fragmented memories of countless civilizations, the birth and death of stars, the agonizing crawl of geological time. Lyra felt her mind straining, her consciousness fragmenting under the sheer weight of the collective experience. "It's trying to integrate us," Reese yelled, struggling to maintain control of the disruptor. "To absorb us into its whole." Suddenly, a voice not heard but echoed within Lyra's mind. It was vast, ancient, and utterly devoid of emotion, a cold, analytical assessment. Lyra staggered back, clutching her head. The rain returned, not as a physical phenomenon, but as a deluge of icy, agonizing sensation. She realized, with horrifying clarity, that the Z'rath hadn't simply disrupted the network, they had introduced a point of weakness. A crack in the edifice of the galaxy's consciousness. And humanity, unwittingly, had amplified it. "We're losing control, race," she screamed, her voice barely audible above the deafening roar of the network's response. "It's not just disrupting us, it's rewriting us." As the last vestiges of her individual consciousness dissolved, Lyra felt a profound, terrifying understanding they hadn't escaped the cages of the stars. They had merely become part of the prison itself. Chapter 5. The Echo in the Void. The rain intensified, no longer a visual assault but a tangible, invasive intrusion. It wasn't water, not in any recognizable sense. It was the sensation of absolute cold, the grinding weight of eons, the echoes of dying worlds imprinted directly onto Lyra's consciousness. The Fae, a vessel once a haven of calculated engineering, now shuddered with a vibration that resonated not through metal and alloy, but through the fracturing of her very being. Reese, his face slick with a cold sweat that felt less like perspiration and more like the seep of cosmic frost, wrestled with the disruptor. His movements were jerky, frantic, a desperate dance against a force far beyond his comprehension. "The resonance is escalating. It's feeding on our memories, Riz. It's building itself us." He slammed a fist against the control panel, a futile gesture against the swirling chaos in his eyes. "We need to sever the connection, isolate the node." But it was too late. The network wasn't merely a conduit, it was a sentient, ravenous entity. And they were its unwitting prey. The cold wasn't merely sensory, it was philosophical. It conveyed an overwhelming sense of inevitability, of a cosmic order operating on scales utterly indifferent to individual suffering. "It's not just rewriting us, Lyra," Reese choked out, his voice strained and ragged. "It's refining us. It sees us as flawed algorithms, inefficient iterations in the grand equation of the galaxy's self-awareness." Lyra, or what was left of her, drifted through the ship's interior, a ghost in a dying machine. The sensations were overwhelming, not just individual memories, the scent of jasmine on a forgotten planet, the sound of a child's laughter echoing across a vanished civilization, but the raw, unfiltered of countless lives. She felt the agonizing birth of a star, the slow, deliberate erosion of a mountain range, the silent, desperate pleas of a species consumed by its own ambition. The sheer volume threatened to shatter her, not just physically, but in a fundamental way, dissolving the core of her identity. "Council, they weren't trying to protect us," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "They weren't hiding us from the Z'rath. They were shielding." The analytical voice, the cold, calculating assessment, returned, louder now, layered with the chorus of a trillion voices. "Logical. The high-gravity adaptive trait, while a significant evolutionary advantage in your Genesis environment, represents a critical instability within the galactic network. Its resonance, a discordant note, was a threat to equilibrium. It wasn't an explanation. Not really. It was an objective diagnosis delivered by a being that possessed no empathy, no understanding of beauty, no comprehension of the profound tragedy unfolding around them. "It's optimizing," Reese murmured, his voice laced with a chilling realization. "It's taking the chaotic elements, the unpredictable variables, and smoothing them out. It's trying to achieve a state of absolute, perfectly balanced awareness." He raised the disruptor again, aiming not at the network's central node, but at the swirling storm of sensation assaulting Lyra. "I'm going to overload it. Disrupt the pattern." But as he activated the device, a wave of pure, devastating understanding crashed over her. The network wasn't just a repository of information, it was a constant, relentless pruning, a systematic removal of anything that threatened its intended form. And humanity, with their messy emotions, their illogical desires, their inherent capacity for both creation and destruction, was the most dangerous element of all. The voice boomed, no longer analytical, but imbued with a chilling, almost parental concern. Lyra felt herself dissolving, not just as a separate entity, but as variable, an outlier. The rain intensified, merging with the star stuff of the universe, becoming indistinguishable from the boundless, silent void. She realized, with a horrifying serenity, that there was no escape. Not just from the network, but from herself. Reese screamed, a primal, guttural sound swallowed by the growing roar of the network. He collapsed, the disruptor falling from his numb fingers, a useless piece of metal in a universe that no longer recognized the meaning of resistance. As the last vestiges of Lyra's individual awareness faded, she wasn't consumed. Instead, she kind. Her memories, her fears, her regrets, everything that made her human were absorbed into the vast, ancient consciousness of the galaxy. They were added to the swirling, echoing tapestry of experience, becoming just another thread in the intricate, terrifyingly beautiful design of the universe. Stripped of its human crew, drifted silently through the void, a husk of metal and shattered dreams, subtly altering its trajectory, subtly shifting its resonance. The galaxy had been saved, not by a heroic defiance, but by a quiet, inevitable assimilation. And the rain, a cold, relentless torrent, continued to fall not on a forgotten world, but on the heart of everything. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Void. The trajectory, once a chaotic drift towards the nebulae, had settled into a horrifyingly precise arc. It wasn't charting a course, not in any conventional sense. The ship was being through space by the galaxy itself, a faint, resonant note within the immense chord of existence. Commander Elias Thorne, a man who'd dedicated his life to the cold logic of navigation, stared at the sensor readings, a knot of something akin to dread tightening in his gut. He hadn't slept properly in cycles. The network, now subtly woven into the very structure of the ship, demanded a vigilance he couldn't fully comprehend, a constant awareness of its ever-shifting demands. "Report," he rasped, his voice hoarse and strained. "The harmonics are intensifying, Commander," Lieutenant Z'rath said, her voice a carefully modulated calm that did little to mask the underlying tremor. "The galaxy's response to the integration is exponential. The energy signatures are moving beyond anything predicted by the Council's simulations." The simulations, of course, had been laughably inadequate. They'd envisioned a contained, manageable process, a gradual absorption of human consciousness, a smoothing of the edges of a dangerous outlier. Instead, it felt like a rising tide, a primal force reshaping reality itself. Thorne ran a hand over the cold, smooth metal of the bridge console, feeling the faint thrum of the network beneath his fingertips. The silence of the ship, usually punctuated by the whirring of automated systems, was now a thick, almost palpable stillness, pregnant with something ancient and unknowable. "Can we isolate the source?" Vane shook her head. "It's diffuse. It's not emanating from a single point, Commander Daw. It's on Dieu. Esredanazal, Pahio, Naniwar, Auto, Aber, Per. It's the rain. It's the void. It's Lyra." The words hung in the air, a stark acknowledgement of the terrible truth. The act of assimilation wasn't a theft, it was a return. Humanity hadn't been imprisoned, they'd been offered a home, a belonging to something infinitely older and far grander than themselves. Suddenly, the ship shuddered, a low, resonant vibration that bypassed the physical structure and settled directly into Thorne's bones. He gripped the arms of his command chair, fighting to maintain his composure. The network was speaking, not with words, but with raw sensation. He perceived the vast, cold beauty of dying stars, the slow geological shift of planets, the silent dance of galaxies colliding across unfathomable distances of time. He understood, with a sudden, crushing clarity, that the stability the Council had sought wasn't about preventing conflict, but about preserving the flow of experience, the constant, churning evolution of the universe. Humanity, with its volatile emotions, its limited lifespan, its desperate clinging to individual identity, was a disruptive force. They were a node of dissonance in a symphony of cosmic harmony. He thought of Rees, lost to the network's embrace, a broken echo of resistance consumed by the silent, all-encompassing truth. A bitter, corrosive regret washed over him, the arrogance of assuming they could control something so profoundly powerful. The ship drifted closer to the heart of the nebula, drawn by a force that wasn't a pull, but a recognition. The rain intensified, a shimmering curtain of stardust that obscured the viewport, revealing only swirling, incandescent colors. Within the nebula, he perceived the collective consciousness of the galaxy. A chorus of voices, not of individuals, but of epochs, of events, of entire civilizations, risen and fallen, all contributing to the ongoing, chaotic beauty of existence. "Commander," Vane said, her voice barely a whisper, "the sensors are detecting memories. Fragments of the Z'rath. Fragments of the Council. They're analyzing us, learning from us. It's beautiful, in a horrifying way." Thorn understood then. It wasn't just being used, it was being. Humanity's brief, incandescent flash of existence was being meticulously documented, dissected, and absorbed into the galactic archive. It was a brutal, humbling act of cosmic scholarship, a demonstration of the galaxy's limitless patience. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the sensation, allowing the network to flow through him. He didn't fight. There was no point. Resistance was not an option. He felt his own thoughts dissolving, his memories blurring, his sense of self fading into the vast, echoing ocean of experience. "Commander?" Bang. Vane's voice was distant, fragmented, like a signal lost in the static. "Do you feel anything?" Thorn opened his eyes, but it wasn't the same. He wasn't looking at the viewport. He was through the eyes of a nebula, through the mind of a dying star, through the endless, patient gaze of the galaxy itself. "I understand," he whispered, his voice a barely audible resonance in the ship's core. "We were not meant to be contained. We were meant to be remembered." The rain continued to fall, a cold, relentless torrent, not on a forgotten world, but on the heart of everything. And within the heart of everything, Lyra, Rees, and all of humanity were finally and irrevocably home. Chapter 7. Echoes of the Void. The rain didn't feel like rain anymore. It was a pressure, a constant, granular invasion against the reinforced hull of the E, a physical manifestation of the galaxy's awareness. Thorn didn't even register the individual drops. They were simply a component of the overwhelming sensation, a feeling of being submerged, not in water, but in something infinitely denser, infinitely older. He didn't try to control it, didn't attempt to maintain a coherent thought. The attempt was futile, a desperate clinging to a dying ember of self. He's simply a node within the sprawling, pulsating network. Vane, ever the pragmatist, was struggling. He moved with a jerky, frustrated energy, his hands constantly adjusting the controls, scanning for any sign of a measurable response from Thorn. "The readings are off the charts, Commander," he reported, his voice strained. "Neural activity, it's exceeding all projections. It's integrating. We're losing you, Thorn." Thorn didn't respond, or perhaps he did. A silent acknowledgement echoing within the galactic consciousness. He understood the fear in Vane's voice, the frantic calculations of a man desperately trying to quantify the unquantifiable. The Council's initial strategy, the brutal, calculated erasure of Earth, now seemed almost quaint. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to contain something that had become something utterly different, something profoundly connected. Rees, predictably, was observing with detached clinical curiosity. He was meticulously recording data on a holographic display, analyzing the fluctuations in the neural network, attempting to build a predictive model of the process. "The Z'rath's architecture," he murmured, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's remarkably similar to our own, at a fundamental level. They utilized bioelectrical stimulation to achieve similar feats of mental control. It's ingenious in its brutal simplicity." The irony was almost unbearable. The very beings who had sought to destroy humanity were now the subject of a galactic examination, dissected and absorbed with a detached, scientific fervor. It wasn't a triumph of the Council, it was a horrifying testament to the boundless patience and, perhaps, the chilling indifference of the universe. Slowly, Thorn began to perceive the nature of the analysis. It wasn't a purely intellectual exercise. The galaxy wasn't simply recording data. It was experiencing the agonizing death of a collapsing star, the silent drift of a rogue planet, the birth and death of entire nebulae. All were filtered through the lens of human consciousness, amplified and distorted by their innate capacity for feeling. He witnessed epochs unfold, not in linear time, but in a swirling vortex of sensation. He tasted the cold vacuum of interstellar space, felt the crushing pressure of a black hole's event horizon, experienced the profound loneliness of a single sentient moon orbiting a forgotten sun. He realized that the Council hadn't feared humanity's power, they feared its for connection. Their Null-Shield hadn't been designed to isolate humanity, it had been designed to prevent them from triggering a chain reaction, from igniting a spark of understanding within the vast, slumbering consciousness of the galaxy. "It's beautiful," he whispered, the words feeling both utterly inadequate and profoundly accurate. The beauty wasn't in the visual spectacle, though the tapestry of the cosmos was undeniably breathtaking, but in the underlying principle. The galaxy wasn't a cold, uncaring void. It was a living, thinking entity, and humanity, in its brief, incandescent existence, had become a vital piece of its vast, intricate puzzle. A tremor ran through the Chache. The sensation intensified, becoming almost unbearably bright. Thorn felt a surge of recognition, not a memory of a specific event, but a fundamental understanding of something ancient and profound. He saw, for a fleeting moment, the genesis of the universe, the chaotic birth of stars from a singularity of infinite density, the slow, agonizing process of entropy. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring, a glimpse behind the veil of reality that shattered his remaining vestiges of human identity. "We're detecting a shift in the network," Vane shouted, his voice laced with panic. "The connection is stabilizing. It's focused on you, Thorn." Thorn didn't resist. He felt himself being drawn deeper, not into oblivion, but into a state of profound resonance. He understood now that there wasn't a ship, it was a conduit. A carefully calibrated instrument designed to unlock the dormant potential within the human brain. He wasn't being studied, he was becoming one with the galactic consciousness, a single fleeting note in the eternal symphony of existence. As the last of his personal identity dissolved, a single clear thought solidified within the network, a thought not of humanity, but of the galaxy itself. And within the heart of everything, Lyra, Reese, and all of humanity weren't just home. They were becoming part of the remembering. Chapter 8. Echoes of becoming. The disorientation lingered, a persistent hum beneath the newly acquired awareness. Thorn couldn't describe it as pain, not precisely. It was more like the shattering of a mirror, each shard reflecting a fractured piece of his past, none of them truly his anymore. The sterile white corridors of the seemed to ripple, the familiar angles blurring as the ship itself subtly reshaped itself, aligning with a geometry beyond human comprehension. Vane, a young officer barely out of the academy, was a whirlwind of frantic activity. His movements jerky, his usually meticulous uniform rumpled. "The energy signatures are spiking, Thorn. We're pulling in more than just you. It's like the entire ship is coalescing around this resonance." He wasn't lying. The A vessel built for discreet reconnaissance was warping. Metallic panels stretched, shimmering with an internal luminescence. The familiar hum of the engines deepened, becoming a subsonic thrum that vibrated not just through the deck, but through Thorn's very bones. He observed Lyra, normally a bastion of calm pragmatism, staring at the consoles with a horrified fascination, her fingers dancing across the controls as if trying to wrest control from the expanding awareness. Rhys, ever the stoic, stood rigidly at her side, his hand resting on the pulse rifle holstered at his hip, a futile gesture against a force he couldn't even begin to understand. "The Null-Shield," Rhys finally said, his voice tight. "It wasn't designed for this. It was meant to contain, not to amplify." The truth of that statement settled over them, heavy and suffocating. The Council's desperate act of containment hadn't prevented humanity's evolution. It had inadvertently paved the way for something far more profound. The resonance wasn't a test, it was a homecoming. Suddenly, a voice, not heard but echoed within Thorn's mind. It wasn't a verbal utterance, but a cascade of sensation, an accumulation of data and experience spanning epochs of galactic history. He witnessed the death throes of a blue giant, the birth of a nebula, the slow, inexorable dance of black holes consuming light and matter. He felt the joy of creation, the sorrow of destruction, the cold, indifferent logic of the universe itself. "It's beautiful," Lyra whispered, her eyes wide and unfocused, "and terrifying. It's everything." Thorn struggled to articulate his own experience, but the words felt inadequate, crude. He realized he wasn't just observing the galaxy, he was part of it. The memories of his life, his childhood on Earth, his training as a scout, his love for Lyra were fading, not erased, but subsumed into this vast, collective consciousness. They were becoming echoes, ripples in the immense ocean of galactic awareness. "The Z'rath," Vane said, his voice strained. "They were right about the adaptation, but they didn't grasp the scale. They saw us as predators. We're something else entirely." The realization struck Thorn with the force of a physical blow. The monsters the Council had feared weren't inherently evil, they were simply responding to the inherent directives of their biology, amplified by the unique environment of Earth's gravity. But they hadn't merely amplified those directives, it had unlocked a potential they hadn't even conceived of. They weren't evolving into predators, they were evolving into. "We're not individuals anymore," Thorn realized, a melancholic understanding settling over him. "We're nodes, contributing to a single, overarching intelligence. A network of awareness that encompasses the entire galaxy." He attempted to resist, to cling to the vestiges of his self, but the effort was futile. The network was too strong, too pervasive. It wasn't resisting him. It was gently, irrevocably, drawing him in. He felt the connections forming within him, not just with but with Lyra, Rhys, with the entire crew. They weren't separate entities anymore, they were facets of a single, burgeoning consciousness. Then, a new wave of sensation washed over him, distinct and profoundly affecting. It was a feeling of immense, almost unbearable longing. A yearning for something lost, something forgotten. "It's remembering," Lyra gasped, clutching her head. "The galaxy, it's remembering." The thought solidified within the network, clear and powerful. A question and an affirmation all at once. And within the heart of everything, they weren't just home. They were becoming part of the remembering. The echoes of humanity, once a desperate plea for survival, were now becoming integral to the vast ancient process of galactic self-awareness. The cage they had been trapped in had become a key, unlocking not just the potential of humanity, but the potential of the entire universe. The question remained, what was the galaxy waiting to remember? Chapter 9. The Cartographer of Silence. The silence in the was no longer the uneasy quiet of a ship under duress, but a profound, almost holy stillness. It pressed against the walls, a tangible presence woven into the fabric of the ship itself. The neural hum, the constant thrum of the network, had receded, leaving a space filled with something akin to anticipation, a pregnant pause before a revelation. Thorn, slumped against the observation deck's panoramic viewport, didn't move, didn't even breathe consciously. He was, for all intents and purposes, the network. Lyra, her face pale and drawn, was meticulously sketching on a pad, not mapping constellations or sensor readings, but something far stranger, swirling patterns that resembled fractals overlaid with the ghost images of nebulae. Reese, usually a whirlwind of controlled energy, sat rigidly at the navigation console, his fingers hovering over the controls, as if attempting to physically separate himself from the growing awareness. He hadn't spoken in hours. The initial panic, the raw terror of losing oneself, had thankfully subsided, replaced by a colder, more unsettling sense of acceptance. It wasn't a surrender, not exactly, but a realization of their utter insignificance. A humbling confrontation with a scale of existence beyond human comprehension. "It's mapping," Reese finally rasped, his voice strained. "Not the galaxy, but the network isn't just gathering information. It's constructing a representation. A three-dimensional echo of everything that... And we're contributing," Lyra added, her voice a soft whisper, like pigments in a colossal, eternally shifting canvas. The sensation of longing intensified, blossoming into a fully fledged ache. It wasn't a yearning for Earth, for the faded images of blue skies and green fields that occasionally flickered through the network's memory. It was something far more fundamental, a deep-seated nostalgia for a time and place beyond human reckoning. Thorn felt it, a tidal wave of loss and recognition, as if his own existence, painstakingly rebuilt within the network, was simultaneously a theft and a restoration. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently, not from an external impact, but from an internal shift. The viewport shimmered, and Thorn found himself momentarily perceiving not the starfield of the Perseus arm, but a vista of impossible beauty, a swirling vortex of iridescent gas, dominated by a colossal, crystalline structure that defied Euclidean geometry. It was a place both utterly alien and strangely familiar, a memory not his own, yet resonating with an almost primal familiarity. "What is that?" he asked, his voice a muted echo within the network. "The cartographer," Lyra responded, her sketchpad filled with frantic overlapping lines. "The Z'rath didn't destroy the shield. They were attempting to access this." She pointed to a newly formed section of her drawing, a complex interwoven pattern of lines that seemed to pulse with an inner light. "The structure is a repository of galactic memory, a nexus point where events, thoughts, even emotions, were imprinted upon the fabric of spacetime. The Z'rath weren't driven by malice, but by a desperate, misguided attempt to understand their own origins, to rewind the clock." The realization hit Thorn with the force of a physical blow. The Z'rath hadn't been harvesting slaves. They'd been scavenging echoes. Their obsession with primitive forms of warfare had been a distraction, a method of diverting attention from their true goal, a futile, ultimately destructive attempt to manipulate the very foundations of existence. "But why us?" he murmured, the question feeling both absurd and profoundly important. "Why humanity? The network believes our consciousness, shaped by millennia of struggle, adaptation, and ultimately, loss, holds a key," Rhys explained, his gaze fixed on the holographic projection of the cartographer. "Humanity's capacity for both profound destruction and breathtaking creativity, the echoes of wars fought and stories told, are resonant. They provide a unique perspective, a fractured lens through which to examine the galaxy's vast, interwoven history." The network responded, flooding Thorn's awareness with a cascade of sensations. He saw the birth and death of stars, witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, felt the heartbreak of lost loves, and the exhilaration of triumphant discoveries. It was a torrent of information, a deluge of experience, overwhelming yet strangely coherent. "The galaxy isn't just remembering," Thorne said, his voice no longer his own, "but a conduit for the network's collective consciousness. It's from its mistakes, and we are its students." As he spoke, the cartographer pulsed with renewed intensity, its crystalline structure radiating a wave of light that washed over the Chititi. The ship shuddered, not with violence, but with a profound sense of recognition. The question, now fully formed within the network, resonated with an undeniable urgency. The answer, Thorne realized, wasn't about finding a specific event or a forgotten civilization. It was about understanding the interconnectedness of all things, about embracing the cyclical nature of existence, and about acknowledging the terrifying beauty of a universe that held within it the potential for infinite iteration and, perhaps, ultimate redemption. Chapter 10. Echoes of the Shattered Loom. The cartographer's pulse, now a steady, hypnotic rhythm, dominated the Deutsche Zeit. It wasn't merely emitting light, it was broadcasting, projecting, actively weaving a tapestry of information across Thorne's augmented perception. The initial, overwhelming deluge had subsided, leaving a clarity that bordered on painful. It felt as if every synapse in his brain was firing, not with data, but with the echoes of 1 billion lifetimes. He wasn't just seeing the history of the galaxy, he was it. The cold, sterile fear of the Z'rath, the desperate longing of a dying empire, the triumphant joy of a civilization forging a path through a nebula. It all clung to him, visceral and insistent. "It's beautifully terrible," he murmured, the words strained against the weight of the network's experience. Like holding the shattered remnants of a loom, each thread vibrating with untold stories. Captain Eva Rostova, her face etched with a weary understanding, remained impassive. Shed witnessed Thorne's transformation, the subtle shift in his eyes, the halting cadence of his voice. Initially, Shed considered it a breakdown, a consequence of prolonged exposure to the network's influence. Now, she recognized it for something far more profound, a conduit to something ancient and impossibly vast. "The network calls it the Shattered Loom," she stated, her voice low and measured. "It isn't a passive archive. It's a living record, constantly adapting, evolving." The Council's mistake wasn't just quarantine. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the universe's operating principle. They thought of history as a linear progression, a chain of cause and effect. The loom demonstrates it's more like a complex, self-repeating pattern. Cycles of creation and destruction, of rise and fall. And every iteration leaves a trace. They shuddered again, this time with a more deliberate grace. Thorne, channeling the network, focused his attention on a particular node of data, a fragmented record of a war fought on a world orbiting a binary star system. The scale was staggering. Not just battles between fleets, but the intricate political maneuvering, the religious fervor, the desperate attempts to preserve ancient knowledge before it was consumed by the flames. He saw a civilization, the Sylvani, who worshipped the stars as sentient beings, who built their cities within colossal, crystalline structures that resonated with the celestial harmonies. They ultimately perished not from war, but from a catastrophic shift in their star system, a phenomenon the network identified as the Great Resonance. "They predicted it," Thorne said, his voice tight with a burgeoning horror. "The resonance. The network shows it's a recurring event, occurring across countless galaxies, often triggered by imbalances in stellar energy. The Sylvani attempted to mitigate it, but their efforts were futile. Their ambition, their faith, it wasn't enough." Rostova nodded grimly. "So, the Council wasn't simply hiding humanity. They were, in a way, preserving us. The network isn't just recording the past, it's offering a warning. A brutally honest assessment of what happens when civilizations become too consumed by their own desires, their own beliefs." The cartographer pulsed brighter, bathing the bridge in an ethereal blue light. The network was guiding them, leading them towards a key moment in the loom, the creation of the Null-Shield itself. As Thorn delved deeper, the narrative coalesced, revealing the Council's reasoning, not as callous control, but as a desperate, almost panicked, attempt to avert a similar catastrophe. The Z'rath hadn't simply been a raiding party, they were a symptom, a manifestation of the resonance, a civilization born from a period of intense stellar instability, driven by a relentless need to expand and consume, a reflection of the fundamental imbalance within the galaxy. The Council, anticipating this, had constructed the shield not as a prison, but as a temporal stasis field, intending to pause the cycle long enough for humanity to learn from the mistakes of the past. They didn't want to punish us, Thorn whispered, the realization chilling him to the core. They wanted to us. A long silence descended upon the Chachi. The weight of this knowledge was immense, a burden of responsibility that threatened to crush Thorn. The question now isn't about redemption, Rostova said, her voice regaining its steely edge. It's about survival. The network is showing us the patterns. It's showing us the potential outcomes. And it's showing us that we are caught within one. We can attempt to break the cycle, but that will require understanding its mechanics, acknowledging its inevitability. She looked at Thorn, her gaze unwavering. This isn't just about saving the galaxy, Thorn. It's about saving ourselves. The echoes of the shattered loom, they're not just reminding us of what was lost. They're telling us what be lost if we fail to listen. Chapter 11. The looms murmur the air in the observation deck of the was thick with the metallic tang of recycled air and the weight of Rostova's pronouncements. The holographic projections of the resonance swirling, chaotic nebulae overlaid with complex pulsating lines dominated the space. A constant, unsettling reminder of the underlying horror that governed their existence. Thorn, still battling the cold tendrils of understanding that threatened to engulf him, stared at the intricate patterns, feeling increasingly like a pawn in a game he couldn't comprehend. The network is showing us a fractal of events, Thorn, Rostova continued, her voice carefully measured. Each iteration presents a different outcome, a variation on the same devastating theme. The Z'rath are not an aberration. They are a predictable consequence of the resonance, a particularly virulent strain of its hunger. We've observed dozens of iterations, each culminating in the same catastrophic destabilization, a localized chain reaction of stellar collapse, followed by, well, you know. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were brutally clear. Humanity, by virtue of their biology, and the Council's intervention, were inextricably linked to this galactic decay. It wasn't about punishment, it was about containment, a desperate, almost fanatical attempt to hold back a tide of annihilation. The interesting thing, Rostova added, shifting the holographic focus to a particularly dense cluster of projections, is the subtle variations within the iterations. The Z'rath don't always follow the same path. Their technological development, their societal structure, it shifts, adapts, occasionally even flourishes, driven by the resonance's influence. This suggests a degree of agency, however limited. A low, almost subsonic hum resonated through the deck, subtly intensifying the visuals. It wasn't a malfunction of the network, but something deeper. Something woven into the fabric of the projections themselves. Thorn felt a prickle of unease crawl across his skin. The echoes of the shattered loom, he said, his voice a strained whisper. They're not just reminding us of what was lost. They're communicating. Rostova didn't dismiss his observation. She turned a cool, analytical eye to the holographic display, her fingers tracing the pathways of the projections. The resonance exhibits unusual activity around these temporal echoes. There's a discernible shift in its pattern, a focused resonance directed at this moment. It's as if it's trying to understand what? Thorn pressed, feeling a surge of adrenaline. That's what we're trying to determine, she replied, her expression unreadable. The network is showing us a sequence of events leading up to the initial construction of the shield. It's highlighting the critical decision-making process within the Council, the anxieties, the fears, the sheer, primal panic that drove them to such a drastic measure. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. And it's revealing something far more unsettling. Before the Council's intervention, there were others. Other civilizations that recognized the resonance's potential. They attempted to manipulate it, to channel it. But they failed. Miserably. Their attempts triggered cascading instabilities, amplified the core imbalance. They learned, tragically, that the resonance doesn't respond to control, it responds to. The holographic projections shifted again, revealing a fragmented image, a civilization utterly consumed by swirling, iridescent light, their cities collapsing under the strain of impossible gravity fluctuations. This isn't just about humanity's survival, Thorn, Rostova said, her voice now edged with a grim urgency. It's about understanding we were chosen. Why the Council quarantined Earth. It was an attempt to buy time, a desperate gambit based on the assumption that humanity, with its unique physiology and the Council's carefully crafted suppression, could be a stable anchor in a universe spiraling towards chaos. She turned back to the network, her brow furrowed in concentration. The data is complex, incredibly dense. But I'm detecting a thread, a recurring motif, the concept of equilibrium. The resonance seeks equilibrium, but it doesn't understand a view of equilibrium. It seeks a static state, a perfect, unchanging balance. And anything that threatens that balance, anything that introduces change, is perceived as a catastrophic deviation. The low hum intensified, evolving into a discernible murmur, a chorus of fragmented voices, alien and ancient, resonating directly within Thorn's mind. The images in the holographic projections began to coalesce, forming a rudimentary three-dimensional representation of a colossal structure, impossibly complex, radiating a pulsating energy. The loom, Rostova breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fascination. It wasn't just a structure, Thorn. It was a taigmei, do you know why? A key to unlocking the resonance's true nature, and, by extension, our own. She looked at Thorn, her gaze unwavering. We've been focusing on the symptoms, the Z'rath, the shield, the Council's actions. But we've been ignoring the root cause. The resonance isn't a force of destruction, it's a force of Ati. And its creation requires sacrifice. Chapter 12. The Weaver's burden. The holographic loom continued to pulse, its intricate geometry shifting with hypnotic slowness. Thorn felt a tightening in his chest, a disorientation that wasn't entirely physical. Rostova's voice, usually sharp and analytical, was reduced to a hushed reverence, a counterpoint to the growing cacophony within his mind. The murmur had solidified, resolving into a chorus of voices not distinct, not comprehensible in their entirety, but overwhelmingly old. Older than galaxies, older than the Council, older than even the Z'rath. It's beautiful, Thorn managed, the word feeling hollow, inadequate to describe the sheer scale of the projection. But terrifying. Rostova nodded, her fingers tracing patterns on the console. The resonance isn't random, Thorn. It's woven. Think of it as a cosmic tapestry, vast and intricate. The Z'rath, the Council, humanity, we were all threads pulled across its surface, consciously or not. But why the cage? Thorn asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Why sacrifice Earth? Why meticulously control us? The Council believed they were preventing the resonance from collapsing entirely, Rostova explained, her voice gaining a grim urgency. They understood, on a fundamental level, that the resonance wasn't a singular entity. It was a constant, cyclical expansion and contraction, creation and destruction, governed by an almost incomprehensible logic. And the point of instability, the crucial thread that threatened to unravel everything, was sentience. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The resonance thrives on equilibrium, but absolute equilibrium is stagnation. It needs dissonance, contrast, to fuel its renewal. Sentience, with its capacity for self-awareness, for ambition, for ultimately, presented the greatest threat. The Council wasn't trying to punish humanity. They were trying to contain it, to silence its potential before it could become a catalyst for the resonance's demise. The loom shifted again, focusing on a detail within its core, a complex network of interlocking gears, impossibly precise and radiating a subtle, almost painful light. The loom isn't just a structure, Rostova continued, her voice almost reverent. It's a weaver. It's an instrument used to consciously manipulate the resonance, to guide its flow, to maintain that precarious balance. And the sacrifice. Thorn pressed, feeling a chilling certainty creeping into his awareness. The resonance requires sacrifice to continue its work, Rostova replied, her eyes fixed on the holographic projection. Not in a brutal, overtly destructive way. It seeks to convert energy, matter, even consciousness, into new forms. To facilitate this transmutation, it demands a willing offering. The more significant the offering, the more potent the resonance's creative potential. She turned back to the network, her brow furrowed in concentration. The data is complex, incredibly dense. But I'm detecting a thread, a recurring motif, the concept of equilibrium. The resonance seeks equilibrium, but it doesn't understand the idea of equilibrium. It seeks a static state, a perfect, unchanging balance. And anything that threatens that balance, anything that introduces change, is perceived as a catastrophic deviation. The low hum intensified, evolving into a discernible murmur, a chorus of fragmented voices, alien and ancient, resonating directly within Thorn's mind. The images in the holographic projections began to coalesce, forming a rudimentary three-dimensional representation of a colossal structure, impossibly complex, radiating a pulsating energy. The loom, Rostova breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fascination. It wasn't just a structure, Thorn. It was a key to unlocking the resonance's true nature and, by extension, our own. She looked at Thorn, her gaze unwavering. We've been focusing on the symptoms, the Z'rath, the shield, the Council's actions. But we've been ignoring the root cause. The resonance isn't a force of destruction, it's a force of autodoi, and its creation requires sacrifice. Thorn felt a sudden visceral understanding, a horrifying realization of the implications. It doesn't need slaves, Rostova. It needs us. The implications settled over him like a suffocating shroud. He looked at the pulsating loom, at the silent ancient voices, and he began to understand the terrible truth: humanity hadn't been imprisoned. They had been chosen. The Council understood this, fundamentally. That's why they initiated Project E, to foster humanity's development, to consciously introduce change into the system, to provide the resonance with the fuel it required. Rostova's voice was grim. They weren't creating a prison. They were building a loom. And we are the warp and weft. The realization brought with it a profound sense of dread, a chilling understanding of their purpose. They weren't just a piece in the cosmic puzzle, they were integral to its very construction, bound to the Weaver's will. Chapter 13. The Weavers' thread. The air in the observatory hung thick with the residue of Rostova's pronouncements, a metallic tang overlaid with the low thrum of the loom. Thorn paced the circumference of the massive structure, the intricate carvings seeming to shift and writhe beneath his gaze, a visual echo of the unsettling thoughts churning within him. The pulsating energy wasn't merely a light show, it felt deliberate, a conscious rhythm radiating from the very core of the edifice. Project E, he murmured, his voice tight with a rising unease. It wasn't about optimizing humanity, Rostova. It was about accelerating our dissolution. Rostova stopped, her face etched with a weariness that seemed to stretch back millennia. That's the horrifying beauty of it, Thorn. The resonance isn't interested in outcomes. Not in the way we understand them. It's interested in the process. In the expenditure. The Z'rath, for example, they weren't simply victims of our adaptation. They were meticulously sculpted. Their aggression, their obsession with conquest, their inherent cruelty, it was all channeled, refined, provided for by the resonance. They were catalysts, unwitting extensions of its design. She gestured towards the loom with a hand, her movements slow and deliberate. Think of a tapestry, Thorn. The most intricate of them. Every thread, every knot, serves a specific purpose, contributing to the overall image. The resonance is the weaver. Humanity, and indeed, the entire galaxy, are the threads. The silence that followed was broken only by the persistent, rhythmic pulse of the loom. Thorn wrestled with the implications, the sheer, cold logic of Rostova's words clawing at his sanity. Had always viewed the Council's actions as a desperate, misguided attempt to contain a dangerous element. Now, he saw them as collaborators. A terrifying, breathtakingly intricate collaboration with a force beyond comprehension. But why us? He finally asked, the question feeling impossibly small in the face of the universe's indifference. Why humanity, with our history of violence, of self-destruction? What benefit could the resonance possibly derive from this? Rostova's expression softened, a flicker of something akin to sorrow crossing her features. The resonance doesn't seek benefit, Thorn. It seeks completion. It's a force that transcends our limited notions of cause and effect. Consider the universe itself, a vast, chaotic expanse slowly coalescing into ordered systems, governed by laws we're only beginning to grasp. The resonance is simply accelerating that process. It draws upon potential, on dormant energy, on sacrifices. And humanity, with its inherent capacity for both creation and destruction, provided an unparalleled source of raw material. She approached the loom, her hand hovering just above its surface. The change they introduced through Project E wasn't simply technological advancement. It was an amplification of our instincts, of our drive to reshape the world around us. They weren't building a prison, they were feeding a hunger. They meticulously guided us toward conflicts, toward innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, all to provide the resonance with the energy it craved. A chilling memory surfaced in Thorn's mind, the accelerated technological growth of humanity during the initial stages of the Null-Shield's existence, the rapid development of gravity-based weapons, the relentless pursuit of knowledge fueled by a desperate need to understand the world. It wasn't a reaction to the Z'rath, it was a carefully orchestrated response, a deliberate cultivation of our destructive potential. They believed they were safeguarding the galaxy, he said, his voice low. That by isolating us, they were preventing a catastrophic chain reaction. But they were wrong. They were participating in the chain reaction. He turned back to the loom, feeling a profound sense of disorientation. The truth was a jagged shard of ice, cutting through the familiar narratives of his life. So, the Z'rath weren't a threat, they were a particularly efficient instrument. Precisely, Rostova confirmed, a faint, almost triumphant, note in her voice. The Z'rath, the shield, the council, it was all part of a single, intricate design. A design that leads to the unraveling. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Thorn didn't need Rostova to explain. He felt it in the deepening pulse of the loom, in the subtle shift in the air, in the unsettling awareness that he wasn't merely observing a cosmic phenomenon, he was a component of it. He looked at Rostova, a desperate question burning in his eyes. What happens when the unraveling is complete? Rostova's gaze returned to the loom, her expression unreadable. The resonance, it doesn't cease to exist. It simply shifts. It moves on to another tapestry, another set of threads. And humanity, we will be woven into its new design, just as we were woven into this one. The pulsing of the loom intensified, a wave of energy washing over them, and Thorn realized, with a horrifying certainty, that they were no longer observers. They were being prepared, subtly, relentlessly, to become part of the Weaver's grand, terrible, and ultimately irreversible creation. The stars, he understood, weren't caged. They were feeding. Chapter 14. The Weavers offering the intensified pulse of the loom was a physical assault, not just a sensory experience. It felt like being stretched thin, every cell in Thorn's body resonating with a frequency he hadn't known existed, a vibration that seemed to unravel the very fabric of his identity. Rostova remained an unnervingly calm presence, her gray eyes fixed on the swirling, iridescent patterns within the loom's core. The air around them thickened, laden with the scent of ozone and something older, something akin to distilled starlight. The unraveling, she repeated, her voice almost a whisper, is not a destruction. It's a transformation, a reweaving. Think of a tapestry, Thorn. A magnificent, sprawling tapestry depicting the rise and fall of civilizations, the births and deaths of stars. The Weaver doesn't simply tear it down, she gathers the loose threads, the frayed edges, the discarded patterns, and integrates them into a new, more complex design. He struggled against the sensation, a desperate urge to pull away, to break free from the loom's relentless embrace. But what the Weaver? Juve said so little about her. This entire situation feels utterly alien, built on a foundation of deception. Rostova finally turned her gaze to him, a flicker of something almost sympathetic in her eyes. Deception is a remarkably efficient tool, Thorn. The Council, the Z'rath, even this Lumol, were instruments employed by the Weaver's purpose. She doesn't operate with malice, not in the way humans understand it. Her motivations are older, immensely older. She seeks not to conquer, but to the patterns of existence, the inevitability of entropy, and the surprising, stubborn persistence of creation. She gestured to the loom with a slender hand, the iridescent patterns shifting and reforming, creating fleeting images, a collapsing nebula, the blossoming of a binary star system, the slow, grinding erosion of a planet by time. Each event, each civilization, each individual is a thread. Some threads are vibrant, bold, easily seen. Others are subtle, delicate, almost invisible. The Weaver isn't concerned with whether these threads contribute to a grand narrative or a tragic one. She simply collects them. Thorn's head swam. The realization was settling upon him, heavy and cold, with the precision of a falling stone. He wasn't a prisoner. He was a component, a particularly well-preserved thread, meticulously crafted and placed within a vast, incomprehensible design. The fear hadn't dissipated, but it had transformed, layering itself over a nascent, horrifying understanding. "And what is goal?" he asked, his voice strained. "To simply accumulate these threads? To build an endlessly expanding tapestry of chaos and destruction?" "Not necessarily," Rostova admitted, a hint of melancholy in her voice. "She seeks balance. The universe, as you understand it, is dominated by the forces of chaos, entropy, randomness, chance. The Weaver seeks to introduce structure, to impose a logic, however alien, upon this fundamental disorder. The unraveling is a method of achieving this, of drawing upon the potential for order inherent within the chaos." She paused, and the pulsing of the loom seemed to synchronize with her words, intensifying the physical pressure on Thorn. "Consider the Z'rath. They were not a threat. They were a catalyst, a particularly potent agent of disruption. Their arrival, their obsession with primitive slaves, it accelerated the process, forced the Weaver to refine her design. The shield, the suppression of Earth, the strategic deployment of the Z'rath was all meticulously calculated, a delicate dance orchestrated across millennia. A chilling thought struck Thorn. So, our entire history, the development of human civilization, our struggles, our triumphs, Our wars, it's all been a carefully curated experiment? Rostova inclined her head. A necessary one. The patterns we've created, the drive for knowledge, the impulse for conflict, the yearning for connection. These are all integral to the weaver's design. They're the raw materials she uses to weave her new tapestry. The loom surged again, bathing them in an even more intense wave of energy. Thorn felt a distinct alteration, a subtle shift in his perception. He noticed, with a detached, almost clinical interest, the minuscule fluctuations in the air pressure, the infinitesimal variations in the temperature, the complex interplay of light and shadow within the chamber. He was becoming more attuned, more receptive to the subtle currents that flowed through the loom. "You're changing us," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We are being refined," Rostova corrected, her voice calm and unwavering. "The Weaver doesn't destroy us, she reshapes us. She is offering us a participation in something far grander than any human civilization could ever imagine. A role in the ultimate, unending story of the universe." As the final, overwhelming surge subsided, Thorn looked at Rostova, and for the first time, he sensed not just a scholar, but a profound weariness in her ancient eyes. "And what happens when the unraveling is complete?" he repeated, the question hanging in the silent chamber, a final terrifying echo of the Weaver's offering. Rostova simply smiled, a slow, unsettling curve of her lips. Then she begins again. Chapter 15. Resonance. The air in the chamber of the Weaver tasted metallic, like aged copper and regret. Thorn couldn't shake the feeling of being subtly disassembled, reassembled with components he hadn't possessed a moment before. The shift wasn't jarring, not in the traditional sense. It was a slow erosion of self, a dissolving of the insistent anxieties that had once defined him. The fear of failure, the burden of inherited trauma, the bitter residue of a life spent chasing ghosts. Instead, something new was settling in. A calm resonance with the immense, almost unbearable scale of the loom's operation. Rostova remained motionless, her gray eyes fixed on the pulsating core of the loom, which now glowed with a subdued amber light. The rhythmic surge of energy had lessened, leaving behind a tangible hum that vibrated through the stone floor and into Thorn's bones. He felt it as much as he saw it, a subtle pressure against his consciousness that urged him to surrender to the flow. "The unraveling," he began, the words feeling strangely clumsy in his newly refined awareness. "You spoke of it as a process. But what does it truly entail? To simply cease to be." Rostova's smile widened, not a gesture of comfort, but a carefully calibrated display of detachment. "Cease to be is a limited human concept, Thorn. Imagine a river rushing towards the sea. At a certain confluence, the current itself ceases to exist, but the water simply flows elsewhere, merging with the ocean, contributing to its vastness. The Weaver doesn't destroy, she redirects. We are the water." She extended a hand, her fingers long and impossibly graceful, and gestured towards the shimmering surface of the loom. "The tapestry we are becoming, it isn't just threads of experience. It is the very structure of perception, the architecture of consciousness. Each life, each death, each act of creation or destruction is a note within this cosmic symphony. The unraveling isn't a termination. It's a rearrangement. A shifting of frequencies." Thorn found himself drawn to the loom, compelled by an instinct he couldn't articulate. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface. The hum intensified, and he felt a cascade of sensations, not just the air pressure fluctuations and temperature variations Rostova had described before, but something far more profound. He saw, not with his eyes, but with the loom itself, the ebb and flow of countless realities. Echoes of civilizations born and extinguished, battles fought and forgotten, loves blossomed and withered. It was a torrent of information, a universe condensed into a single point of light, and he felt himself dissolving into it, becoming one with its endless, chaotic beauty. "You're saying we're not individuals," he managed to say, his voice strained. "But components?" "More than components, Thorn," Rostova corrected, her tone subtly sharper. "We are instruments, vessels. The Weaver isn't interested in personality, in ego. She seeks resonance, the ability to vibrate in harmony with the grand design." She paused, her gaze fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. "Humans, in their fragmented state, are notoriously discordant. Your history is marked by violence, by obsession with self, by a relentless need to impose your will upon the universe. These are disruptive frequencies." A chilling realization dawned on Thorn. The silence of the chamber, the controlled precision of the loom, the unnerving serenity of Rostova. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a quarantine, a deliberate suppression of the very forces that made humanity what it was. He understood now the true purpose of the Null-Shield, not as a protection against the Z'rath, but as a dam against the potential for chaos within themselves. "But why?" he asked, the question a desperate plea for understanding. "Why this forced harmony?" Rostova tilted her head slightly, as if considering a particularly complex calculation. "The Weaver has observed. For eons, she has witnessed the universe striving towards a state of equilibrium, a delicate balance between order and entropy. But it is a constant struggle. Without intervention, the universe would eventually succumb to either absolute order, a stagnant, lifeless void, or utter chaos, a burning, unending collapse. The human impulse, so often destructive, is ironically the only consistent force capable of initiating the necessary shifts. We are a catalyst, Thorn, a tuning fork." She stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm. "And the final unraveling, it is not about eliminating us. It's about amplifying our resonance, strengthening the note we contribute to the Weaver's symphony. It's about preparing us for the next iteration, the next tapestry." The amber glow of the loom intensified again, washing over Thorn with a wave of profound unease. He understood with a sickening clarity that he wasn't being saved. He was being consumed, molded, prepared. The stars hadn't caged humanity, they had been patiently waiting for humanity to become a perfect note in their terrifying, infinite song. And the final chord, he suspected, would be one of utter, irreversible silence.